Going to expand throughout the exercise and actually go through a few slides and show some impacts that like NVIDIA has had on the marketplace and really some of the cost and the lack of resources that are needed to actually accommodate the innovation and the boom of the AI. And again, Heath comes from an environment where he's working with resources that are required and sometimes very, very hard to find and using unique technology. So I'm going to hand this over to Heath for a moment to introduce himself quickly.
Hello, my name is Heath Lovell. I'm Chief Operating and Development Officer of Dair Capture, Inc. We are a direct air capture company, direct air capture and product company. We have some assets that we're baking forward, and we're very much involved in data center development.
All right. Well, that being said, and I'm kind of going to go a little backwards here. Tab Schadt, CEO, founder of Liftr Insights. For the last 6-7 years, we've been capturing, obtaining very unique information around chip configurations, semiconductors, CPUs, GPUs, for about 85% of the global market. And we provide this market intelligence and this alternative data, if you will, data-driven market intelligence to everybody from data center builders to operators to investors to real estate companies. And one of the questions that we're constantly, or several, is always how is this going to be powered? Where's the water going to come from? How is it going to be cooled? So really the guts. So we bring a lot of the data to the table that just shows more and more velocity and growth in the space. But the reality is you need somebody like Heath out there and innovators at the ground level, and that's what we're going to spend most of the next 15 or so minutes talking about. I want to share a graph though, just to put things in perspective. This is a very high level, just to show that just to show that from an NVIDIA perspective, for instance, you have. It's not an East Coast or a West Coast or a South, or this is just a very high level regional look at the deployment of the most recent chips and semiconductors that have been rolled out. And again, this is very, very high level. There's some people on this call that would say this is so high level, we already knew this, but if we went down to the zone level and to the state, to the city, municipality level, there would be more dots than we could focus on. The point is just to show that it's not an F, it's a win, and it's happening, in great force. This slide here gives you just an idea. It's more than meatball math. Is it exact? No, because it's ever changing depending on the actual grid and the state and the local community that may be developing or deploying the actual chips. But this does give you a very good idea. This is not the cost of these cities. We just took the dash, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, Houston, just to give a state perspective of what it would cost per year, and just in an investment, and then just to have the ongoing maintenance and operating expense for these configurations of an NVIDIA GPUs, and that's not a far reach for what's actually happening at all. So I would call these conservative, quite frankly. And if you back into the power numbers required and the water and the coolant, as well as the impact on the local community, you definitely have deficits in certain places, and you have a lot of investment, some infrastructure, and then some maybe reestablishing these facilities or thinking about them going into different places outside these metro markets.
Yeah, and to speak more towards that, that's the major urban markets. But in my opinion, where a lot of this development is headed is going to be rural acreage and rural areas. These data centers are a lot loud. They require a lot of land. There's being a lot of co-development currently encouraged, and other things like, for example, I'm part of a direct air capture company, and We started out being majorly focused on our own needs. And as we scaled and started putting our assets together and engaging investors and different JV parties to work with on these projects, we started realizing and understanding there was more of a need for our direct air capture technology to be part of co-development and specifically helping out data centers. And a lot of our site plans, for example, they account for data center acreage near where we're having our own projects. And we're partnering with solar groups, we're partnering with battery storage groups, so on and so forth, to help out with some of these projects because they're so intense and they require a lot of acreage. Co-developing these opportunities is very much being encouraged at the moment.
Yeah, and Heath, what I want to do is go back to the day in the life of, which is very interesting, what it takes in a rural environment to actually bring the resources together, whether that's human capital, the land, the water, the power, because that's ultimately what this is all headed. And we see it happening, but there's obstacles. But before that, I wanted to explain, and for you to explain just a little bit more on DAC and the infrastructure there and the solution.
Absolutely. So DAC has been, let's say what DAC is to those who aren't aware of the acronym, direct air capture. So you're taking CO2 that is being emitted out into the atmosphere, you're sucking it in, you're running it through your technology, you separate the CO2, and then you can do numerous things with the CO2 efforts after it's separated. Historically, most of the projects have been like the one you have on the screen here. This is a Climeworks example in Iceland. There are very few projects commercially active in a robust way right now, but this one is. And what you see here are all these fans, right? These little things that come out from that machine or that building are fans. That's what's vacuuming or the capture portion of the project. Quite frankly, those fans are some of the most expensive parts of the model. When you plug that input in there, it makes the numbers look interesting and really does some fascinating things to your margins. But to be more specific towards direct air capture and carbon capture in general, the previous administration was very much focused more on injection sequestration. Currently, the new administration just rolled out their new incentives about a week ago, and they're pushing towards product development companies. And what's interesting is a lot of companies are strapped by an injection project, and they do not have the ability to make products currently. So they're sitting ducks. But there's a lot going on with direct air capture, and it's very much being encouraged by the current administration to co-develop with these data center opportunities.
Yeah, so, all right. So now let's go. We gave a visual of a gigantic topic. Let's take this back to how does this get off the ground? Okay, if you're in rural New Mexico or a resource-rich West Texas, or for that matter, anywhere, but the solutions to help are there, right? Because again, this is for the greater good. It's happening. It's to ease the impact of the grids and the resources in the metro areas that perhaps maybe don't have those infrastructures in place today, but are working hard to do it. But also to expand. Where does that start? I mean, because this is the questions that we get all the time. We know, like Liftr Insights, we know what's inside the black box, right? We know the configurations. We know the semiconductors, the AI. What are they trying to achieve? The machine learning, all of those things, right? The tech. But at the end of the day, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're almost back to kind of an old school model to catch up. You got to go talk to somebody that's actually sitting on all the resources. You got to go jump through some hoops. And we get asked this question all the time. Then okay, I can afford that capex for this amount of chips, right? And here's why: because the demand's there, and we were asked to build certain machine learning or neural networks or what have you. But that didn't solve the original question though of how do we get started and where's the best place. Kind of walk us through that.
Precisely. So let me kind of expand on that for you. I'll say this: you mentioned landowners. I'm working with a lot of landowners, big acreage landowners in the Texas Panhandle and in the New Mexico on the east side of New Mexico from the north border to the south border. Um, and a lot of these guys are asking me lots of questions. I drink coffee with a lot of these guys, and they don't understand data centers. They don't understand the chip component. Um, what they think about data centers is it's the engine behind the transmission lines that are about to get shoved down their throats. And that's what they're most concerned about are is the transmission infrastructure that's awaiting the development. But I will say what gets these guys going and when they start understanding it is when you start talking about the amount of chips between the end of their exhaust all the way up to the manifold and how often they have to replace the exhaust on these diesel motors. They understand that. And then when you tell them, well, that's what's behind the data center to a degree, that's one of many different things, light bulbs start to go off. Oh, that's what's going on.
Right. It's a eureka moment, and it's a good metaphor because again, everyone's great in a specific area, but in this particular case, it kind of took us by storm, and and you can take this all the way from capital markets and valuations from Wall Street and deployments. But the reality is, it's affecting everybody. And again, it's not a negative thing. It's just you got to solve it. Um, what happens when you run into the landowner that has the resources and says, "I just don't understand it, or I don't want to do it"?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish with that landowner. If you're using that landowner, or say using, that's not the appropriate term. If you're working with that landowner to develop a data center project, that's a very intriguing conversation because, as you know, these are multi-layered projects. So let's kind of talk through that a little bit. One thing they like to understand is what's the power for, how much water is going to be used, and at the end of the day, what most landowners, specifically ranchers and farmers, care about is how much acreage are you taking away from my own use.
Exactly.
You see all these agreements in wind and solar, and they decide to make different pieces of equipment worth different things per acre. And at the end of the day, these landowners don't care. The land is worth one thing to them, and it's what you're taking away. And whether it's a turbine, a transmission pole, or a battery storage, they want to know about acreage loss. And then I mentioned water. These are very water-intensive projects. And the aquifers in a lot of these areas are drying up. The Ogallala is drying up. New Mexico is drying up. The Texas Panhandle is drying up. And these are some very active areas where these data centers are going to be developed. And it's going to be interesting to see how water affects that and power demand. But it looks like the power demand is going to come through and be there regardless.
So let me ask you this: when you get to the actual solution, and you get back to what's the monetization? Where do they cross the path? Do they cross the path of goodwill to society, or do they cross the path to is there income producing, or is it okay? I understand what you're saying now. I mean, where's that epiphany, or is it a little bit of all of those?
Well, let's kind of speak towards that quickly. One thing that helps is you hit the nail on the head: development comprehension. I don't care whether it's carbon capture, hydrogen, data center, geothermal. These farmers and ranchers, they're used to oil and gas, and now they know solar. Wind is obviously something they can wrap their head around, and now they're finally understanding battery storage. And then you add all these other development practices, and it's like, what? And how and where? But involving these landowners intimately is what it takes. And I mean, you sit there and you hold their hand through everything you're doing. Because one thing that they don't like is not understanding what you're doing with their land. And taking care of the land steward and bringing them along through the full development cycle of your project, tendering upside in different ways and making it worth their time. That's how you get these deals done.
So well, let me ask you then from there. Now that if you've accomplished that, then where do you go from there?
First thing you do is you go and start JVing your projects. You secure a solar group, a battery storage group, a company like a Kiewit or one of these big groups that makes all the bells and whistles we need for the projects, and also need to engage the regulatory bodies, because the second you turn around and go to them, they don't know what you're talking about. So you want to engage them early too, because they end up creating framework for you as you work with them.
Right, and why this is so important, again, back to the audience, is why this was a great topic, is it's such a high level topic for a lot of people. Like you said, there's audiences you have to turn to that they have different levels of knowledge, because they have other interest and or just, this is just it's a very, very expansive, subject. So, so I mean, when we put together the playbook, if we will, like, a day in the life of, which we've kind of done, and we've addressed the land. We know the importance of that. Without the land, you run into, you got to have the land at some level. The power, I do agree with you that the power is working itself through probably better. The water, that's where the immersion techniques and things of that nature are really, really important, because you've got to make a lot out of a little at that point. But then you get to the local, the government component. So again, if we go back to the audience and they're saying, okay, we have the capital to deploy a data center. We don't think downtown, San Antonio is the best place to do this, but we do 100 miles out. This is arbitrary, but I mean, there's some pretty good resources as you head that way, as there are around the rest of the NFL cities around the country. If you look at the maps and the deployment areas, then are you talking or helping the actual local lobbyist, or are you actually having those conversations yourself? Like, you're walking in and you're educating face to face to say, again, here's the reality. It's rolling, and we have an opportunity to help. So I'm kind of walking you through the stages, and now we're at this government phase that could get very, political, to say the least.
So let me expand upon that. A lot of what's driving the business in general are what type of power the groups want. You have some groups that are saying we want behind-the-meter systems with storage and solar. You have some groups like Chevron that are marrying themselves to natural gas. And then you have some groups that are claiming nuclear, like Meta. Well, what's interesting to me is look at the timeline of what it takes to develop a nuclear facility. They're doing one in Los Alamos. You have groups like Chevron that are doing a huge hydropower project not far from where I'm living, where they're going to be making power by moving water. And in my opinion, the groups that are making the most sense out of it are choosing the behind-the-meter systems and natural gas. The groups marrying with themselves with nuclear are kicking the can down the road, but they're going to be robust when those are happening. That being said, there are emerging markets. Like, for example, the Texas Panhandle is about to have theoretically going to have, I say theoretically, going to have a $300 billion data center that's called a hypergrid AI campus. And it requires 5,800 acres, and it's nuclear powered. And these projects are going to take years and years and years. And if I'm a company that wants to develop data center, I want to turn my project on quickly, because my investors are going to be riding my case. Returns within 3 to 5 to 7 years. And how do you power projects within that timeline?
Exactly. How do you? That's where I'm going. That was the tail end of the question. So you already knew where I was headed with that. It's funny, we didn't rehearse any of this, but at the end of the day, it's the ROI, right?
Yes.
That's big. That's a lot. So how do you expedite that and get out of harm's way? And I think that's where you're headed.
Well, your biggest expense is power. Your second biggest expense is water. Then you have everything else that falls in after that. And you need to be selective where you do these projects. You can't just place a 5,800 acre data center project anywhere. It has to have all the pieces you need. And there have been groups that are doing that. the way you can help increase your margins and help with the ROI is choosing the right groups that are picking the right type of power for their projects, like a Chevron, or Nvidia's doing some interesting things. You have Musk's groups and all these other groups. They're choosing to do different things, and at the end of the day, it's going to be a hybrid approach. And when you're looking at that model, whatever makes your margins look the most attractive to you and your investors is what you're going to do.
Yeah, and that's what I've seen a lot of. Is you've seen that the let's call them the power companies, energy companies, whether it's downstream or alternative, uh, the partnerships with the actual uh, chip companies, right? Because those you got the supply and the demand, and then the water's just the trickiest one of all, uh, because it's just harder to you know produce, if you will, in alternative methods. And then, but there's cooling technologies, and then you have the landowner, which we discussed them. That's a conversation. So it's really it's a psychological, good, you know, this is what needs to happen. You're in a good spot to help. Hopefully, you're on board. Take it through a political system. Partner with the right power sources, and when I say that, I mean ancillary power sources. The power, the storage, the generators, those folks, and then obviously your bigwigs. I mean, just call, like you said, your Shells, your Chevrons, what have you, and then you're all the way back to, and then your chip companies partnering, and then you're back to kind of this water, which I think we're all in agreement. That's probably the trickiest one. If you said on demand, it needed this much at any given time. Albeit, I can tell you in Texas that we haven't had that problem, lately. But that's not a sustainable model, Mother Nature. So it's an interesting multitude of legs on the bar stool, if you will. What do you do when you try to bring it to closure, though, and get it to a presentation to pass through like a bill? Like, what is it? What is that final outlook? I mean, is the ROI in there? Are all the investors involved in there? Is the data center in there, or is there anonymity involved, or is it more about, can you just help us free these things up?
I mean, there's some anonymity involved. I'm working with some lobbyists in Santa Fe. Then I've dealt with some lobbyists in the state of Texas and in Colorado, helping them understand more about these projects. I'm working with a bunch of county commissioners in New Mexico right now that are my friends, and they control 31. It's called 31 Counties Strong, and they're in the process of disputing some transmission infrastructure, and I'm kind of their informant, and I help them understand what this stuff is. But you pair with the right groups. You can't just bake in your ROI needs into framework, because really the framework right now is allowing them to happen. And that's what's driving a lot of this, is people are finally getting their opportunity and putting on, and then they're kind of circling back on some of that.
Well, we're about to wrap up here, but we do have, we got 7 questions in queue here. So and one of them is, I should have known, the anonymity factor. I guess by its very nature, it's anonymity, but is that typically the financial component? Or is that the
financial
landowner
component, location? I mean, that's why we're here talking, right? Location, location, location. And I don't care what you say. If you don't have this place to put any of the technology, then your technology doesn't matter. And that's the end-all, be-all. And I've dealt with this struggle with tech investors and development investors. There's always a war. What's more important, the technology or the location? And it's almost always the location.
It just sounds like 30 years ago when I was buying a house, it was location, location, location from the realtor. It's funny how that never changes because they don't buy. There's no more land. The other question was where, and whether you have this answer or not, the attributes of the most water. I guess what would be the most attractive place, assuming money? The question is actually addressed. If it's financed and the landowner's on board, where would the water be most favorable?
So where would the water be most favorable?
And maybe you want to address the Southwest because that's a specialty, or maybe
Oh, you mean
around
like
the country.
regionally speaking? Yeah.
Regionally speaking, that's correct.
The Southwest, Southeast, the Midwest is well. You get to Kansas, Nebraska. There's a lot of water, but like for example, you need to partner with the right groups that have less water-intensive technologies. Our capture device is water positive, so there's some technologies out there that you can be working with that aren't so burdensome on the water component of the project.
Well, that's good. Unfortunately, LinkedIn's about to shut us down. So we got 5 more questions, but we're running out of time. So I want to wrap it up. And Heath, thank you so much. It's a day in the life of what it really takes to get one of these deals done. And like I said, we're talking in chips and the tech and the motherboards and all of those things. And the reality is there's so many things at the ground level. So your input at what it really takes to get a deal done and really put one of these facilities in a rural market is very, very important because these are questions asked all the time. So really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for the time, and I really enjoyed this. And I hope people learn something. I can talk to a fence post about this for days. I know you can.
I know you can. All right, man. Have a great day, and thank you everybody for joining.